Hey everyone, welcome to another video. With House of Dragon being a huge release at the moment, I wanted to watch the original show first so that I can understand whatever references that House of the Dragon might throw at me. So I decided to finally watch Game of Thrones after watching small amounts here and there. So let's get into it. I will let you know before I dive fully into this review that I will be covering full spoilers for Game of Thrones from season 1 all the way to season 8, so definitely watch the show first.
No, thank you, spoiler alert.
When I first saw Game of Thrones, it was when season 8 initially released, and my partner, who is a huge fan of the show, made me watch it with her. And at the time, I didn't mind it all that much. However, I couldn't really understand why this was the show that garnered so much hype every time a new episode released. I then tried to watch season 1 and honestly I just got a little bit bored, and for me, I really think that Game of Thrones does not get off to the best start. I hadn't found the characters all that compelling yet, and it was a little too slow in its pacing for me. That is until we hit the episode where Ned Stark gets beheaded, and from that moment on I was hooked. With this review I am going to have chapter markers and I'll be talking about full arcs for some of the major houses and players in the show. I don't expect I'll be covering everything because that video would take 10 hours. So let's firstly talk about my favorite house in the whole show, the Starks. So the Starks are pretty much the clear-cut good guys in Game of Thrones. They are noble and loyal to their own, and they are my favorite house because of their intentions. Ned Stark is obviously the original protagonist to the show, and it seems so shocking that Game of Thrones was happy to kill off the protagonist in the first season to progress the story. And I think originally, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff did a fantastic job of writing the show and keeping the momentum going after such shattering events. After Ned, it moves to Robb Stark as the protagonist, who honestly might be my favorite of all the Starks. He was focused on this revenge mission to take over King's Landing after hearing the news of his father's death, and I loved how he really embraces the role of King of the North after Ned dies. He leads the Stark in many battles, and unfortunately he starts to lose favor and respect with his allies after opting to marry for love instead of duty. With all of this happening, it leads to near the end of season 3, where we get one of the greatest episodes in the show and one of the most intense moments in Game of Thrones, the Red Wedding. I knew about how this was an iconic moment in the show, but I didn't know what had happened, and holy shit, what a shocking scene. When the whole thing starts and the phrase start by murdering Robb Stark's pregnant wife and then they continue to murder everyone else, it was such a sad scene, especially as someone who really loves the Robb Stark character. He made mistakes and he made enemies with the wrong people, but I thought at the time his army is really strong and that he had a chance of making it to King's Landing. No, he dies by getting stabbed multiple times, and the scene has a full stop moment where Catelyn Stark murders one of Frey's incest wives and someone walks across and slits her throat. It brings such a finality to a scene that was extremely intense, and honestly it felt like it wasn't going to end due to how much carnage was going on. Then we have Sansa, who is probably one of my least favorite characters in the whole show and is definitely my least favorite in the Stark family. She starts off kind of naive as she dreams of being a princess and a queen, and then she gets absolutely tortured by the Lannisters and mainly the king, Joffrey. Joffrey was such a hated character to the point where the actor who played him, Jack Gleeson, seemed to retire from acting because he didn't seem to think that acting was fun anymore. And that could have been because he had faced death threats and such a negative reaction he got from fans for basically doing an excellent job at playing this vile character. But Joffrey is terrible to her. He shows Sansa her father's head on a spike and treats her like absolute garbage. Sansa then continues to get married off to people that she doesn't want to be married to. She becomes a character you become quite sympathetic towards, especially when she gets married off to the Boltons, who were involved in betraying Robb Stark. Ramsay Bolton, her husband, is an absolute sadist and maybe the most despicable character in the whole series. What he does to both Sansa and Theon is just barbaric and made the show a little hard to watch at times.
You're an evil man.
After the conflict with the Boltons comes to an end after the epic battle of the bastards, and Sansa being a key part to that, as well as having that moment of revenge where she gets to feed Ramsay to a pack of starving hounds, is such a badass moment. However, her downfall to me starts in season 7, and to me, she just doesn't get that much better in season 8, which will be a pretty much consistent theme throughout the whole video. Sansa seems to become a little bit of a know-it-all who just won't listen to what anyone else has to say, even if she may be wrong. She's a smart character who definitely makes some excellent decisions, but I think she just does this so frequently, where she is constantly undermining Jon Snow and disagreeing with everyone all the time, that it just becomes very annoying after a while. Her arc ends with her being Queen in the North, which on paper sounds fine, but in its execution it just feels like a little bit of an underwhelming decision, because she makes Winterfell an independent kingdom and basically just goes back to Winterfell and that's it. As I said, it's fine on paper, but the show just doesn't make that moment for Sansa finally being free after dealing with all these tyrants. That she finally has some power for the first time in her life, it makes that whole moment feel so flat and doesn't bother to show us how much of a monumental moment this is for her. Arya Stark is another excellent character in the series. I honestly have loved how Game of Thrones has handled its female characters. Arya is a genuine badass who gradually becomes maybe the most dangerous person in the whole show. Her arc is also quite compelling, as she spends a lot of time on the run from the Lannisters after they killed Ned, and she gains some very valuable connections throughout. I loved her dynamic with the Hound, because Arya gradually becomes a lot like him in personality, while in the beginning, he is the furthest thing from what Arya wants to be. She eventually becomes a member of the Faceless Men, who I absolutely loved in this show. Some of the training Arya had to do was a little bit boring at times, where she's just kind of cleaning and just doing chores. But when she learns to fight blind, it just makes her that much more dangerous. The real major thing with Arya though is that she's basically hunting for revenge the entire time that the show is running. And when she does get that revenge and kill people, she does it in the most twisted ways that feels really satisfying because of what these people have done to her. After she kills Walder Frey for being the person responsible for the Red Wedding, she kind of goes nowhere as a character and kind of just becomes someone you know is really dangerous, but her character just isn't really going anywhere. Her arc ends with her giving up her need for revenge after the Hound convinces her not to kill Cersei and go save herself after King's Landing is getting absolutely destroyed, and I think it was okay for her to go down that route. I am a little annoyed at how her story comes to a close though, because she just hops on a boat and leaves to discover new lands. While I don't mind her doing that because it is mentioned earlier in the show, it does it in a way where you can tell that they are just aiming for some kind of spin-off show. But because season 8 was a complete and utter failure, it seems that hopes for that show have completely extinguished. So now her story doesn't really come to a complete close, and for such an interesting character, that bothers me, and it's just another reason why season 8 is just such a massive disappointment.
I am disappointed.
Then, the last of the true Stark children that I will talk about here is Bran, who is probably the least interesting character in the whole show at first, as he is just journeying up north to become the Three-Eyed Raven. He became so minimal in his contributions to the show that he was just straight up not in one season. It is when he finally makes that transition to becoming the Three-Eyed Raven that things get a little more interesting for him, in my opinion. The moment when they are escaping the White Walkers and we see Hodor, who is known as this gentle simpleton, was unluckily the one whose destiny it was to hold the door and protect Bran from the White Walkers, that he eventually ends up just knowing that one word. It is such a compelling moment for the show. It's strange after this sequence, as now Bran has this moment where he can basically see all of time and almost becomes something like a god in a way because he just stops caring about everything and he is just no longer Bran. It's really interesting as he becomes quite disconnected from people he was originally close with, but after a season or two, this does get a little bit tiresome. He becomes the king of Westeros when it's all said and done, and I can see how that could be a good decision, but as per a lot of criticisms that I'm going to have with the final 2 seasons, there was almost no time to flesh that out and make him a worthy king. It feels more like a spur on the moment kind of scenario, and because of that, the whole idea just crumbles. There is also so many more things that we could have done to make Bran more interesting, but he just never goes down that route. For example, he has this very strange connection with the Night King, and instead of utilizing Bran as a device for us to learn more about this mysterious figure, we get almost nothing apart from how he becomes the Night King. I remember theories that Bran actually was the Night King, but just from a different time, but none of that transpired, which is unfortunate because having some kind of reveal like that would have been a whole lot more interesting compared to what we got. Now it's time to talk about the Lannisters, who are mainly in charge of Westeros for the majority of the show, and they are mostly considered to be very villainous. I definitely think in the beginning, they are the clear-cut villains of the show, but as it progresses, we do have a few members stay that way, but another group turn around and become some of the nicest people in the whole show. The first example of that one is Tyrion, who is another one of my favorite characters, and is played to perfection by Peter Dinklage. Tyrion's arc is very interesting to me because he probably goes through the most out of any character in terms of the places he goes and the people he meets. I always love that he was the voice of reason whenever a character is starting to get really out of place. He would always put them back in their place. The scenes where he is standing up to Sansa, or himself when talking to Joffrey, or him trying to best his father, who has always despised him, are great sequences that made him a character that you can become quite fond of. Season 4 is one of my favourite seasons of the show because of purely what Tyrion does. The courtroom scenes where he's being pinned for Joffrey's death, and he tells the people of King's Landing that he wished he could have been the one to kill Joffrey, was such a bone-chilling scene and just shows how great of an actor Peter Dinklage is. Then ending the season on the note where he murders his father in maybe the most embarrassing way for Tywin, who is this master strategist and is also played brilliantly by Charles Dance, just sets the tone for the future of the show. He then aligns with Daenerys, and to me, while he is still one of my most favourite characters, his importance to the grand scheme of things just becomes very diminished, as he is the hand to Daenerys, who for most of the show is already a very intelligent character and doesn't really need a hand, made Tyrion's role feel a little less important overall. I don't mind where Tyrion ends up by the end of the show, but making him look like an idiot who made all of these terrible decisions just doesn't sit right with me. He is very intelligent and I know he wants to see the best in his family, but he still makes some really dumb choices that I guess further edges on Daenerys to snap like she does near the end of the show.
What are you doing?
Then we have both Cersei and Jaime Lannister, who are each very interesting characters that I consistently kept changing my opinion on because of how well written the show was. Until season 8. Let's start with Cersei, who I originally hated because she is just this evil woman who almost has no good qualities to her. She's always scheming and is responsible for some of the most vile acts in the show, like pushing the death of Joffrey onto Tyrion and supporting Tywin's wish for him to marry Sansa when both parties really didn't want that. I did grow to like her at a point though, because Game of Thrones does an excellent job of making a very unlikable character someone you sympathize with by putting them through such horrendous circumstances that you would just never wish on anyone. Cersei goes through this in season 5, where she is captured and tortured by the cult at High Sparrow, and afterwards she is forced to walk through the streets of King's Landing naked, where she is yelled at and people are throwing everything at her, including feces, and she becomes broken because of it. After this event happens, she has the zombie mountain wherever she goes because she feels so insecure and broken that it is just hard not to feel something for her. The final episode of season 6, which might be my favorite episode of the whole show, is largely due to her involvement in this episode, where she finally gets her revenge by blowing up the Citadel where all her enemies are in one of the most shocking scenes of the entire show. Now, let's talk about Jaime Lannister, who, as we all know, is Cersei's brother and lover. Now, while the incest is quite strange, and even in these times where that practice was considered a little more common, it is still frowned upon by everyone in the show, as it should be. It's not only that which makes the relationship terrible, it is also the fact that Cersei always brings out the worst in Jaime. After being captured by the Starks, he joins Brienne of Tarth, who is just another fantastic character, and they develop quite a bond. I think it would have been better for Jaime to end his arc with someone who brings out the best in him, like Brienne, because you see that all of the terrible things he does, he really just does it out of love for Cersei. The decision to finally have him be with Brienne, only to just leave and go back to Cersei and go die under some rubble, is one of the most unsatisfying conclusions to a character in the show, because both him and Cersei are some of the most interesting characters, and they have been there since the very first season. I don't mind the idea of both of these characters dying, but to have it done in such an underwhelming way was very disappointing to me. Then we go into the Targaryens, who are the real heirs to the Iron Throne, and Daenerys is who we are led to believe is the last living Targaryen, so she is destined to be the queen. Her goal of becoming a great ruler is done quite brilliantly for such a long time. When she is in Essos and is conquering city after city is some truly excellent television, as you can see her inspire a whole group of people as she frees city after city from slavery. My favorite time she did this was when she was conquering Astapor, and the slave trader is just saying some of the most awful things about her in another language, and at the end of that arc, you realize that she can speak the language the whole time, and then uses one of her dragons to just burn him alive.
Now just fry this fool.
The relationship she has with her dragons is also such a great thing for the show, as it dives into some of the more fantasy elements that Game of Thrones offers. They make Daenerys a genuine threat to take the Iron Throne, and that continues right until the show ends, when she eventually takes over King's Landing. I know the show is alluding to it in visions, but what the writers did with Daenerys after she set sail for Westeros is just a crime. In season 7, she basically starts becoming less of a queen who is ruthless when necessary, and she just does that no matter what the circumstances are. The show is trying to pin it on the fact that she's just lost a lot in a very quick time, but it feels like such a major shift for the character that it just doesn't feel right. The show wants to make it absolutely certain that she is a villain when she decides to burn down King's Landing after they have surrendered, and it just feels so disappointing that they went in that direction for her character. It is almost completely off from where she was almost just 2 seasons ago, that it is almost a completely different person. She is very likable in those first 6 seasons, to the point where she is one of my favorites, but they wrong her so badly in the writing department that she instantly becomes one of my least favorite characters in the entire show. Emilia Clarke does do a fantastic job playing this role, and that continues throughout the show, which makes me feel even worse about how she was written, because she just did not deserve that ending. The other Targaryen to talk about here is Jon Snow, who I would have put in the Stark section because he does have that side to him, And I even think of him as a Stark, but the show, and I am guessing the novels, reveal that Jon is in fact a Targaryen and the true heir to the Iron Throne over Daenerys. Jon is just another excellent character who only gets better with every season. In the first 2 or 3 seasons, he's not that interesting. He's just hanging out with the wildlings, which becomes a key relationship for him later in the show. It's not until he becomes a leader of the Night's Watch that I really started liking his character. He's always willing to sacrifice himself and fight until the very end to achieve the best outcomes for his people. However, while his methods are a little unorthodox, it stirs trouble with certain characters, and because of it, he gets stabbed by quite a few members of the Night's Watch in such a shocking end to a season. There are just so many great moments with this character, and it becomes such an amazing part to what Game of Thrones is. In the Battle of the Bastards, which might be my favorite battle in the whole show, he's a key part to that, as he is fighting even when he's exhausted and is on the verge of death. He just continues fighting. This adds such a nice touch to that particular battle, as he is covered in dirt and blood and fighting to get his kingdom back, while Ramsay Bolton is just standing on the edge of the battlefield and waiting for his men to do his dirty work. It's a great juxtaposition and makes Jon look even better. Jon to me seems like the only character who doesn't get an ending that absolutely just butchers his character by the end. He heads back to the Night's Watch and heads far north with the wildlings after being King of the North and the one to kill Daenerys. As he is the character that really isn't infatuated with power or taking the Iron Throne, this seems like an okay enough ending for him, as he grows this bond with the wildlings throughout the duration of the show. So him being with basically his family now and where he belongs is nice, because in Westeros, he doesn't fully belong to one family. He is technically a Targaryen, but he was raised as Stark, but yet again, he still feels like he is left out. So I don't hate the idea of him being with the wildlings. Now, we have the greatest travesty in the entire show, to the point where I knew it was a travesty when I watched season 8 the first time, when I had no context for the entire show, and that is what they choose to do with the Night King, who was a top 2 favorite character for me. As someone who absolutely loves villains, seeing this cold, almost inevitable force slowly head towards King's Landing is such a tense little side aspect to the show that could have had major repercussions. The Night King and the White Walkers are such a mysterious aspect to this show, and I am at a loss to understand why they did not take advantage of that aspect more. He's really the only character to make others afraid, as he just doesn't care about the politics of Game of Thrones. He is just there to kill anyone standing in his way. He humbles Daenerys, who seems to think she is invincible in season 7 because of her dragons, and he just levels her single-handedly by murdering one of her dragons and making it his own. The Battle of Winterfell has its moments when Daenerys and Jon's forces fight together to try and take down the White Walkers. I love when the Night King gets blasted with dragon fire and it doesn't affect him at all. Or when Jon, in a final act of desperation, runs towards the Night King, hoping to land a blow that will kill him, and the Night King is slowly raising the dead around him to make his forces even larger. However, they throw all of this away by killing him off in just such a disappointing way. I like Arya, but her story has nothing to do with the White Walkers. There are about 4 characters I can name off the top of my head that I would have preferred to have killed him, with Jon being the prime candidate. His whole story has led up to this fight with the Walkers, and the fact that he isn't the one to kill the Night King in a way that feels earned just leaves this weight in my stomach because of how disappointing it was. I mean, seriously? This force that everyone has been nervous about over the course of the show faces its first real test and dies in one episode instead of making it to King's Landing and forcing some kind of uneasy alliance between the Seven Kingdoms out of fear of the dead was just such an obvious way to go, and it would have worked, but instead Arya just kills him and that's it, boom, it's over. I honestly hate how badly this was treated that I just feel upset thinking about it and knowing we cannot go back from that decision. The last thing I want to talk about before I go and talk about the technical elements is just how different season 7 and 8 are from the first 6 seasons. In the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones, it takes its time almost to a fault. It takes characters ages to get anywhere, and you spend so much time with these characters in low points that you just can't help but be fond of them. Pretty much every character you have, there is some reaction to whether you love them or hate them. The show makes you feel a certain way, and that was what made it so special. The world feels rich and layered as you visit all these different places and get to know the characters in each area. Unfortunately, as we get to season 7, we see this change. Characters unlock fast travel abilities basically, and because of that, you don't spend that much time with them and getting to know these characters in season 7. I do think that the show does maintain some of its quality in this season, but you can definitely see it going in a downward slope. But scenes like the Night King blasting through the wall on his dragon and having the army of the dead make it to mainland Westeros is an epic spot to end that season. Season 8 is when the show really goes downhill fast. Season 7 is 7 episodes long and Season 8 is 6 episodes long, basically combining for one whole season. And the fact that you have so much ground to cover in these final 6 episodes just does not bode well, and that just doesn't work. I have already talked about how terrible of a decision it was to kill the Night King so easily and how poorly handled that episode was. There is still a tiny glimmer of hope, however, that they will handle who gets the throne in a satisfying way, as well as handling the Battle of King's Landing in a way that fans have been waiting for and hoping would be quality from the get-go. But no, you could make the argument that what they do there is far worse compared to what they do with the White Walkers.
Sense, no way. No.
To me, the show just lost complete hope of reaching a satisfying ending after episode 5 of season 8, The Bells. Daenerys goes full evil here and tortures King's Landing after they surrender, instantly turning her into an evil character that has become irredeemable. Jaime and Cersei get crushed under some rubble in this episode, which was so anticlimactic for such compelling characters. The only thing that was somewhat satisfying in this episode was the Hound fighting off the mountain and finally getting that revenge where both of them die. That's really it. This to me is by far the worst episode in Game of Thrones history because it gives you no hope that the final episode will wrap things up well, because each of the characters that we love have put all their faith into Daenerys, who instantly gives them terrible blowback that they just can't come back from. The final episode to me might be the best job of handling some of the crap that they had just given themselves. The writers backed themselves into such a corner that they just could not come back from. So that final episode of Game of Thrones just really leaves a sour taste in your mouth and just makes you feel sad, because this excellent show that could have been considered as one of the best ever just crumbles. The characters remain amazing right until the end. The performances remain amazing right until the end. The technical elements are astounding, but the writing just kills this show hard. In this episode, Jon kills Daenerys, which is fine, I guess. Bran becomes the king, which is okay. I think there are a few better options than Bran, but he'll do alright. I always think that this show would have been made so much better if this had 10 to 12 seasons and really took its time to flesh out these major twists and turns that happen in the final 2 seasons. I think it would have led to a much better conclusion because I think some of the major events that happen in these 2 seasons are really good, but it's the way that they are threaded together and the timing of these events that makes the whole thing fall apart. It's quite interesting to see how much Game of Thrones progresses from season to season in terms of its technical elements, because you can see how much money gets thrown at it as we get into the later seasons. I mean, without certain boneheaded mistakes that are made in the Battle of Winterfell in terms of the lighting, both Season 7 and Season 8 are fantastic in terms of their cinematography. I mean, the combination of visual effects with actual location shots is perfectly balanced and will make the show age really well. The costumes and production design are straight up unlike any other TV show I've ever seen. And I don't think a lot of things can match Game of Thrones when it comes to those technical elements. Overall, despite one really sad final season of television, the rest of Game of Thrones is set up to become one of the greatest TV shows ever made. And it is unlike anything I have ever seen. I still love this show because the characters are excellent and the scale of the show is unlike any other television series. I am truly a fan of Game of Thrones and I think I always will be from now on. The show has inspired me to start reading the books, which is something I very rarely do, and I hope that George R. R. Martin changes the ending of this series to something a lot better than what we got in the television show, and I would just go by that as canon. As a whole, I'm going to give Game of Thrones a 4.5 out of 5. This would have been the easiest 5 out of 5 out of any TV show that I've ever seen, but unfortunately because of the fact that it falters at the end, I do have to bump that score down a little. I had considered to bump the score down even further, but because of the fact that I'm such a massive fan of the franchise now, because of how great this show was, I don't want to knock it down too far, because I still prefer this a hell of a lot more compared to a lot of other shows. I do recommend this show, but be warned of the terrible ending. Anyway, thank you so much for sticking with me and watching this video. This one took a hell of a lot of effort to make, so I appreciate you stopping by. As promised, I will tell you what is coming soon for my channel. As per usual, I am still working on that Better Call Saul review. I'm up to the final season right now and I am preparing that video with each season that I finish. So it will be finished shortly after I finish watching the entire show. Stuff that will be coming a little sooner will be my review for the new Whodunit that is coming out to see how they run. And because Blonde will be coming to Netflix very soon, I do plan on doing a review on that one because that film does look very interesting. Remember, if you love film, gaming, or television content, please consider clicking that subscribe button and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.